what I'm going to do today, I want to do two things. The first is slightly different from the style that I usually employ, which is to look at how Meforshim understand the text and how Meforshim understand each other. We're not going to do that today. We're going to do what's sometimes called close reading and concentrate on the text itself and see what we can derive from the text itself. I overheard some of the previous shir, and I understand some of the in the shir, what was in the shir before that, and there will be some overlap with what we just heard, but I suppose that's good because we can always learn more Torah and find out more from the Torah. What I want to do is look at chapter 4, and in particular, look at what a pivot moment it is in the context of the Megillah. And there's a very dramatic change that we will come across. And then I want to explain why that's bad methodology and inappropriate in this particular case. So the first half of the share will be finding the result, and the second half of the share will be why that's not a good method, and I will explain. So chapter 4 of the Megillah follows on from chapter 3, which follows on from chapter 2, which follows on from chapter 1. Chapter 1 is when Achashverosh has a party and Vashti disobeys him and he gets rid of Vashti. Chapter 2 is when he finds a new queen and it turns out to be Esther. Chapter 3 is when Haman comes to Achashverosh and says, I've got a good idea, let's kill all the Jews. And this brings us to chapter 4. And we read as follows. Mordechai yada et kol asher na'asa. Mordechai knew all that was done. Vayikra Mordechai et begadav, and Mordechai tore his clothes. Vayilbash sak va'efer, and he adorned himself in sackcloth and ashes. Vayetze betoch ha'ir, and he went out in the midst of the city. Vayizak sa'aka gadola umara, and he cried a loud and bitter cry. So what is all that has happened? Mordechai knows all that has happened. So some of it is public, in fact, that the order to kill the Jews on Yud Gimel Adar has been promulgated. It's been sent by the scribes throughout 127 provinces. There is more backstory, which we will see that Mordechai is aware of, that might not have been public. Where did he get that information from? Either his network of spies, or Ruach HaKodesh, or a bit of both. And he wears sackcloth and ashes. And as we will see, the garment, the attire, is a very important part of this story. And it's a very important part of the Megillah. When Mordechai is finally appointed to be, whatever you call it, prime minister, he goes out in the city wearing the malchut, wearing the king's robes of kingship. When he's paraded on the horse, he's wearing the king's clothes. There's a lot of clothes in the Megillah. And right now, he decides to wear sackcloth and ashes, sak ve'efer. And he goes out, where does he go? Betoch ha'ir, in the midst of the city. He doesn't go to where the palace is, where Esther is. And by the way, at this point I want to say that this chapter is basically a dialogue between Mordechai and Esther. It's the only chapter in the Megillah like this. It doesn't involve Achashverosh, it doesn't involve Haman, it doesn't involve Persian people. It just involves Mordechai and Esther having a dialogue. Interestingly, they don't meet. The dialogue is conducted either in sign language or through an intermediary. They don't meet, and we'll see very soon why they don't meet. Esther is in the palace. Esther is the queen. She's living the life of the queen. And Mordechai is outside the palace. And he stays outside the palace, as we can see in Pasuk Bet. Vayavo ad lifnei shar hamelech. He came up to the gate of the king, but not through the gate of the king, not into the palace grounds, not into where the court is. Why does he only go up to the gate of the king? Ki ein lavo el shar hamelech bilvosh sak. Because you can't go into the gate of the king while wearing sackcloth. It is inappropriate. So then the question arises, why does he wear sackcloth? If he wants to go to the, does he want to go to the gate of the king? Does he not want to go to the gate of the king? He wants to go up to the gate of the king, but he can't go any further because he's wearing sackcloth. Now, if he has something to do which is going to involve the palace, which he is, and the involvement of the palace is the fact that he's trying to communicate with Esther, one might ask why he's wearing sackcloth. If he knows that because he's wearing sackcloth, he can't go into the palace, why is he wearing sackcloth? So bear that question in mind. We're going to pile up a few questions and then hopefully find a particular way of answering them. It's worth stressing. I said at the beginning, I'm not going to go through lots of different opinions. One certainly can learn the Megillah with many, many, many different commentaries and many, many different ideas for each part, each episode, each word. We're not going to do that. We're going to keep to one particular way of thinking about it, which I hope will be an answer to some of the questions that emerge. Pasuk Gimel. Ubechol medina umedina makom asher davar hamelech v'dato megia. And in all the provinces, the places where the king's word, v'dato, just by the way, the word dat, which we use today with such familiarity to mean religion, dati, religious, occurs first of all in the Megillah, where it doesn't actually quite have that same meaning. It means law. But it's interesting that it emerges in a book which describes the Jews in exile. They no longer are defined by nationality, they're defined by religion. And we find the word dat appearing in the Megillah. Anyway, so all the places where the king's rule reached, Evel Gadol LaYehudim, there was great mourning for the Jews. V'tzom, uvechi, umisped, and there was fasting, and there was crying, and there was lamentation. Sak ve'efer, yutza l'rabim. And sackcloth and ashes was spread out, was provided either for the elite ranks or for the majority or for the masses. So everywhere where the king's writ reaches, the Jews are crying. Except there's one Jew who's not crying, Esther. And this parak, and again, I hope I'm not giving away too much at this stage, talks about the distance Esther has from the rest of the Jewish world. Esther is in the palace. She is not crying. She is not fasting. We'll see why in a moment, and we'll discuss further the implications of that. But Pasuk Gimel emphasizes that everybody else is overcome by mourning, which leads to the corollary that there's one person who is not, who is now going to be mentioned. Number 4, Pasuk Dalach. V'tavona, there's a Ketiv and a Kri, so we'll read it as Tavona, Na'arot Esther, v'sariseha, and Esther's maidservants and Esther's servants, eunuchs, came, v'yagidu la, and they told her. It's not clear at this point what they told her, but we'll find out very soon. V'tit chalchel, and the word titchachel means she was ill, she was shocked, or even there's implications in the word that she had a visceral reaction in her own body and she reacted in a particular way. She's very, very shocked. V'titchachel hamalka ma'od. The queen is very, very shocked. V'tishlach b'gadim lahalbish et Mordechai. And she sent clothes to wear, for Mordechai to wear, ulahasir sako me'alav, and to remove the sackcloth from him, v'lo kibel, and he did not accept. Why does she send clothes? Why does she send clothes? And why does he not accept the clothes? This is a remarkable little mini episode. Now, you might say, and some do, she sent clothes so that he could come into the gate of the king and then he could communicate with her. In which case, what's she missing? She's missing what I asked earlier. If he wants to come into the king's gate, he should put on a nice suit, like the White House discussed recently. And if he wants to wear sackcloth, he obviously doesn't want to come into the king's gate. So she is doing something which doesn't make sense. By sending him clothes, she's saying, well, you must have put on the wrong clothes this morning. Here's the right clothes. Or to deny reality. To put it in a bigger, slightly more macro way, he represents what the entire Jewish world is doing, fasting and crying, and she sees this as just a peripheral problem, a surface issue, that he hasn't got the right clothes. And the problem can be solved by sending him the right clothes. And she doesn't accept. And that's part of the communication, as it were. I said the communication starts off with symbolic language. The symbolic language is he's there wearing these sackcloth and ashes, and she sees the problem as the fact that he's wearing the wrong clothes. And so she sends him the right clothes, but he doesn't accept it. Now, by the way, I can see 1, 2, 3 hands, and I'd love this share to be interactive, so I'm going to throw out questions, and please throw out suggested answers. But I do have a timetable. We have Mincha at 1:20, and I have to stay in control of the ship. So please excuse me if I say we can't take every question at every time. But
okay, you said visceral reaction.
Yeah.
Is that not a gut intuitive feeling?
Well, okay. I thought I would avoid what I would allude to what's suggested because it's really not very nice. One suggestion of Atit Halal is she lost control of her bowels, and another suggestion is she started menstruating. And I didn't really want to say either of those, but now I did for the sake of learning Torah. Okay, there was a question over.
You said she lost touch and brought him different clothes. So I don't see the connection between bringing him different clothes and a visceral reaction.
No, I'm saying she was very shocked. She was very shocked.
To the point that she had a visceral reaction.
Exactly.
But she didn't know what was going on.
But she didn't know what was going on. Now, you might read it as the servants came and told her about the decree of Haman. Right. But it's clear, as you will see in the next pasuk, she didn't know about it. So that's not what they told her. And it's not what she had the reaction to. What she had the reaction to was the message that your uncle, stroke cousin, stroke husband, whatever it is out there wearing the wrong clothes. And that's what she's shocked by. She doesn't know about the decree. That's going to be clear in the next pasuk. So her shock, what I politely called her visceral reaction, her illness, is because her cousin uncle is wearing the wrong clothes. And she doesn't understand why he's wearing the wrong clothes. And she thinks that the clothes problem can be sorted by sending him new clothes. And as I said, to me, that is absurd. There's something missing there. Because if he's wearing the wrong clothes, why is he wearing the wrong clothes? And why does she think that he can now swap the wrong clothes for the right clothes? That's what doesn't make sense. And indeed, Mordechai shows it doesn't make sense by not accepting the clothes. So that's the next part of the dialogue. You send me clothes, I don't accept those clothes. That is not the solution to the problem at hand, even though she doesn't yet know the problem at hand. There was a hand over there? Yes.
I could see the possibility that she's being nudged here. Get dressed properly, come in, tell me what's going on. And he is responding by his reactions, no, come out and see the people.
Okay. At this point, a little bit of speculation. I don't know if she can come out. I think part of the tragedy of Esther is she's locked in the palace. Or she's locked in the harem with all the other women who didn't quite make it to queen, but they're still there. And I think this Perek says a few things about Esther, but it really reinforces the tragedy that she's lost all agency. She is basically a prisoner in the palace at the king's pleasure. Not a good place to be in at all. So I suggest, and I've got no proof of this, that it wasn't an option for her to come out and walk the streets. But maybe. There was a question here. Let's keep to one question, okay? Give me the best shot.
Is there an opinion that says she did know? And when she found out he was actually in sackcloth, she thought, oh, it's not really good for what's happening.
I'm not aware of such an opinion. And I
can't get to him, but I want to let him know that it's not good what you're doing, and so I'm sending him.
Okay. I don't think that, I'm not aware of such an opinion. There may be, as I say, there are literally hundreds of explanations of the Megillah. But it seems to me from what's coming next, she doesn't know. Okay. By the way, and we'll come back to this, I actually was just learning this morning and with the aid of a shir that I saw from somebody else. She's called in Pasuk Daled Hamalka. Throughout the entire Megillah, she is called Esther or Esther Hamalka. There are only two places where she's called Hamalka without the Esther. One is when Haman falls to his knees and tries to plead for his mercy with Esther, and Achashverosh in chapter 7, Achashverosh is just before Haman's going to be killed. Achashverosh says, "Are you going to lichboshet Hamalka imi b'bayit? You're going to force the queen with me in the house," and that makes sense because Achashverosh is focusing on the fact that she's the queen, and it looks, perhaps mistakenly, that Haman is trying to have his way with the queen. Here, however, there isn't such a neat explanation. Here we have Esther and Mordechai starting their dialogue, at the moment still symbolic. And she's not called Esther, and she's not called Esther Hamalka, she's called Hamalka. And maybe there's a significance in that, which I will come back to. Pasuk Hey. V'tikra Esther lahatach, misarasei hamelech, asher he'emid lefaneha. She called Hatach. Who is Hatach? So Hatach plays a significant role in taking messages back and forth between Esther and Mordechai until he disappears from the story or from the narrative. Anyway, Hatach is one of the servants, eunuchs of the king. Asher he'emid lefaneha, whom he, the king, may stand before her. In other words, Hatach is Achashverosh's man, who is Esther's servant. V'tatzavehu al Mordechai, and she commanded him about Mordechai, ledat ma zeh v'al ma zeh, to know what is this and what is this all about. So now she doesn't understand what Mordechai is doing. She doesn't understand why he's wearing the sackcloth and refuses to accept the clothes that she sends him. And she wants to know what's going on. Ma zeh v'al ma zeh. Number 6, Pasuk Vav. V'yetze Hatach el Mordechai el rachov ha'ir asher lifnei shar hamelech. Hatach goes out to Mordechai, to the wide space, the street of the city, which was before the gate of the king. So again, we're reminded what we learned in Pasuk Aleph and in Pasuk Bet, that Mordechai has not come into the palace. He can't come into the palace because he's wearing the wrong clothes, but that's his choice. So Mordechai is not going through the gate of the king. He's standing out there outside in the street. And the Megillah seems to be emphasizing this location. And what's going on here? Let me start to unravel a little bit of this. He is pointing out the distance between himself and Esther. Esther is in the palace. I'm out there in the street. Perhaps you could say, like, I'm out there with the masses, with the people. I'm where you're not. And I'm not going to come into the palace to get closer to your life and your regal and your pomp and your circumstance. I'm out there in the streets. It doesn't quite say I'm with the masses. Perhaps that's the implication. But I'm certainly not in the palace. And the Megillah emphasizes that Mordechai is not in the palace. So Hatach goes to Mordechai. Pasuk Zayim. V'yaged lo Mordechai et kol asher karahu ve'et parashat hakesef asher amar Haman lekashoklo al ginzei hamelech. Mordechai told him, that's Hatach, all that had happened. In other words, all the meetings between between Achashverosh and Haman. Ve'et parashat hakesef, the story of the money. What's the money? So when Haman said to Achashverosh, let's kill all the Jews, he offered him a vast bribe, maybe even more than a bribe, to seal the deal. One idea is that he said, look, if you kill all the Jews, you're going to lose the income, the tax that you get from the Jews. So I will make good the difference. I'll replenish the coffers. And the king said, no thanks, I don't need your money. I just want to kill the Jews anyway. And that is part of the story which Mordechai repeats to Esther. Now, that might not have been public. The fact that there was a plan to kill the Jews, that was certainly public because it had been displayed on every notice board throughout 127 provinces. The details of the fact that Haman had offered such a bribe or such a replenishment, that probably was not public. And maybe Mordechai had his own sources, as I said earlier, or Ruach HaKodesh, some sort of prophetic spirit to know about that. And he tells that to Esther, not just that the Jews are going to be killed, but he specifically mentions, and the Megillah mentions that he mentioned, the Parashat HaKesef. And I suggest to show that how real this threat is. It's something that Mordechai and Achashverosh have both invested a lot in. Haman and Achashverosh, thank you. Haman is prepared to give over all this money. Achashverosh is prepared to forego all this money. That's how serious they are about wanting to kill the Jews. So to finish the pasuk, Al Ginzei HaMelech, that Haman was prepared to literally weigh out the kesef, the money, into the treasury of the king, by Yehudim, for the Jews, la abdan, to destroy them. The word abad, la abdan, is the word often used when we're talking about Haman's plan to make the Jews disappear, to make the Jews be lost, which is a cruel way of saying to utterly destroy them. Remember that word because it will come back. Thank you. It will come back, but we're not there yet. And then, number 8, Pasuk Chet, Ve'et Patshegen Katav Hadat, and the copy of the text of the law, Asher Nitam B'Shushan, which was put out in Shushan, Lahashmideim, to destroy them. Not quite the same word as La'abdam. La'abdam is more harsh, actually. It means to negate them, to cancel them out as if they never existed, to be lost. Lahashmideim is to destroy them. Natan lo laharot et Esther, he gave it to him to show to Esther, ulahagid lo, and to tell her, ulatzavat aleha, and to command her, lavo el hamelech, to go to the king, v'hitchanein lo, and to plead with him, to implore him, ulavakesh milafanav al amah, and to request from him for her people. So now we get to the nitty-gritty of what Mordecai's message is. Mordecai, wearing sackcloth, not going into the palace, staying outside the palace, sends a message via Hatach to Esther after the message of not accepting the nice clothes. The next message is, we're all going to die, and it's now a requirement. He commands her. He gives her a command that she's got to do something. She's got to go to the king to plead for her people. And that is the message that Mordecai wanted to get to her, and now he sends it to Hatach, and now she receives the message. And what does she say? Vayavo Hatach v'yaged leEsther et divrei Mordecai. Pasuk Tet, Mordecai, the Hatach came and told to Esther the words of Mordecai. Pasuk Yud, v'tomeh Esther leHatach v'tatzavehu al Mordecai. And Esther said to Hatach and commanded him to go back to Mordecai. So Mordecai commands her, she commands Hatach, but to send a command to Mordecai. And the message is, Kol avdei, Pasuk Yud Aleph, Kol avdei hamelech, all the servants of the king, va'am medinot hamelech, and the people of the provinces of the king, Yodeim, they all know. Notice that Yodeim was there in Pasuk Aleph, Mordecai Yada, Mordecai knew what had happened. Esther saying, I'll tell you what everyone knows. And by the way, that means you should know as well. Asher kol ish ve'isha asher yovo el hamelech, that every man and woman who goes to the king, el chatzeh hapinimit, into the inner courtyard, asher lo yikareh, who has not been called, achat dato lahamit levad, achat dato lahamit. There's one rule: they're going to get killed. Levad asher levad, sorry, me asher yoshit lo hamelech et shavit hazahav. Except for those to whom the king extends the golden scepter. The word yoshit appears here nowhere else in the Tanakh. V'haya, and v'chaya, and then they will live. V'ali lo nikreti lavo el hamelech zeh shloshim yom. And I haven't been called to the king for 30 days. Okay, let's quickly deal with the 30 days, because I saw there's two nice explanations, and there's probably many more. One is she's saying that I haven't been called for 30 days. I'm sure the king misses me. I'm sure he's going to call me soon. So I'll wait until he calls me. Or he hasn't called me for 30 days. He obviously doesn't like me anymore. And he's probably not going to call me again. Either way, if I go now, I will be killed. And that is why I can't act. Now, there is a huge logical conundrum in Esther's words. Mordecai has said, there's bad news, Esther. All the Jews are going to be killed. Esther says, well, it's all very well asking me to go to the king, but there is a slight technical problem. If I go to the king without being invited, he'll kill me. What's the puzzle here? She's going to be killed anyway. This is the absurdity of her response. She's going to be killed anyway. So what does it matter if I get killed by Haman on the day of everyone's death, or if I die trying to placate it? Either way, I'm going to die. Or put another way, if you do the risk management here, you make a risk assessment, there's a possibility that the king will accept the scepter, and therefore she'll live, and therefore she'll be able to intercede for the people. It may be that the king doesn't extend the scepter, and she'll be dead, but she'll be no worse off than if she doesn't do anything, because she'll be dead anyway. Okay. Okay. Shh. Right. Shh. Okay. By the way, I always get to this point when giving the shir, and I don't normally get such a torrent of people shouting at me, but I'm getting used to how the OU works. There is the story. Mordecai told her not to reveal her people. This has always been a bit problematic to me, because what must have been known is there's a connection between Mordecai and Esther. And Mordecai is certainly known to be the Jew. He's always identified as Mordecai HaYehudi. So what exactly it means that Esther kept her identity secret is not clear. One answer is, yes, she didn't admit she was Jewish, and nobody knew she was Jewish. Which doesn't actually change the point I'm about to get to. It only actually reinforces it. There is a suggestion. Rashi says that when it says not to tell her peoplehood, it means not to tell her royal lineage, that she was a descendant of King Shaul. And by the way, I don't want to get down all these different sidetracks, but I'll just mention that there's a lot of logic to that. The Midrash says that Achashverosh was not of royal blood himself. He was a stable lad who married Vashti, who was the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and that was the way that Achashverosh became king. He just married into the family. And that was why Vashti was a threat to him, because she was more royal than him, and he got rid of her, and he wants to replace her with somebody who comes with no royal baggage herself. He wants to replace her with a nobody. And so Mordechai says, Mordechai says to Esther, don't let Achashverosh know that you're a descendant of King Shaul. And that comes into other parts of the story as well. We won't get into that right now. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is what he meant was don't let people know the connection between Mordechai and Esther, which either was he was her uncle, or was he was a cousin, or maybe he was her husband, which puts a different picture on her relationship with Achashverosh and creates all sorts of other issues. So it could be, but it wasn't such a secret that she was Jewish. Or maybe we'll go back to the standard version that nobody knew she was Jewish. And therefore she is saying, that could answer what I call this logical conundrum. She is saying, nobody knows I'm Jewish, so if I do nothing, I won't die. All the other Jews will, but I won't. And if I do something, I might get killed by the king for not being invited into a meeting with him. That does make a little bit of sense. But now we get to the nub of the issue. And now I'd like to go back to the issue of the clothes and suggest what's really going on between Mordechai and Esther. Is Mordechai has taken off the Persian clothes. How do I know he's taken off the Persian clothes? The clothes he's now wearing keep him excluded from the court. That's why it's significant, but the clothes he's chosen to wear are the clothes that disbar him from being up there with Achashverosh and the courtiers and where the power is and where the epicenter of Persian non-Jewish life is. What's he wearing? Whose clothes is he wearing? The clothes of the Jewish people. Because we saw in Pasuk Gimel, all the Jews are wearing sackcloth. That puts Mordechai's dress choice into a certain perspective, into a certain context. Mordechai sounds like when you read Pasuk Aleph, Mordechai is saying, I'm going to wear sackcloth. This is my statement. When you read Pasuk Gimel, you find out that Mordechai is just doing what all the Jews are doing. It's the background. Yep. And Mordechai, now we can understand better. Mordechai is wearing the clothes that separate him from the royal court, because he is separating himself from the royal court, and he is identifying as a Jew. And now I want to say something which is a bit radical, but I remember I learned this from my teacher, Rabbi Brovender, many, many years ago, so I feel it's worth repeating. What's the visceral reaction? Why is Esther so upset when she hears that Mordechai is wearing sackcloth? We all have somewhere in our family that annoying uncle who's really embarrassing, who turns up at family simchas and pinches our cheek and says something which is a little bit strange or unfiltered, and we just have to sort of make talk around the problem. You know, we all have that. Or maybe it's just my family. Anyway. Esther has that. Who's the annoying uncle who turns up looking Jewish? He's looking Jewish. She is being dragged away from that. She is locked up in the palace. She's called queen because now she's focusing on being queen. And why does she send the clothes to Mordechai? To get him back into shape, but to remove the embarrassment to herself. I, Esther, have a problem with you, Mordechai, wearing these clothes. You're looking too Jewish, and you're embarrassing me. And that's why she sends the clothes. And what is his response? He doesn't accept the clothes. Why doesn't he accept the clothes? Because he's going to stay looking Jewish. She might have forgotten her roots, but he certainly hasn't. So it's not just a technical problem. I'm wearing these clothes, I can't get into the king's gate. He's choosing not to get into the king's gate. He's choosing to wear the clothes that the entire Jewish people is wearing at this time. because he's choosing to identify as a Jew. Remember, he was up there at court as well. He's sitting in the king's gate. He's sending messages. He's identifying plots to kill the king and sending messages to the king to have these Bigtan and Teresh dealt with. He's right up there in Persian society until this moment. Until this moment, he's choosing to be distant from the king, distant from the court, and distant from Esther, and wearing the Jewish clothes. And now we can see. Now, maybe, I don't want to be too cruel to Esther, who was a Neviah, who was a Tzaddikas, so I'm careful of what I say. And maybe what I'm about to say is Mordechai's interpretation of Esther's words. And maybe it's not Esther's actual meaning. Doesn't matter, actually, for the context, for how the story progresses. But Esther says, how can we resolve this logical conundrum, which I said? Esther seems to miss the point. If she goes to the king and he doesn't extend the scepter, she's dead. If she doesn't go to the king, she's dead anyway because all the Jews are going to be killed. Mordechai thinks that Esther thinks she's not one of those Jews. Now, either you can say that she kept her identity a secret, but the result is the same. The result is she doesn't feel that she's included in the decree. I would also say, and I'm very careful about saying this because I'm not necessarily saying about Esther herself, but we all know and we see around us today more than ever, those Jews who say, I'm one of the good Jews. I'm not like one of those Zionists who is committing those crimes. I'm one of the good Jews. I'll put my adverts in the paper and I'll sign a petition to say I'm one of the good Jews. If you want to get the Jews, get the bad Jews, those guys over there, the Zionists. I'm not like that. Unfortunately, that is very much a feature of our time. And it's tragic. And maybe one could, without saying Esther feels the same, but there's the same sort of atmosphere of Esther saying, I'm in the palace. I'm safe. And we know that Mordechai is about to say, you're not safe in the palace, which is why it gives strength also to this interpretation. Mordechai is about to say that don't think you'll be safe in the palace, which implies she does think she'll be safe in the palace. She thinks, I won't be rounded up like the rest of the Jews. And that now makes sense for her response to Mordechai. Now we can understand. Now there's a logic to it. If I don't go to the king, I'll stay alive because I'm not like those Jews. If I do go to the king, he might not extend his scepter, in which case I'll die. So it's better off that I do nothing. It only makes sense if she feels she's not included in the decree. So either you could explain that as nobody knows she's Jewish, that's fine, or you could explain that as she feels she's no longer one of those Jews who's in the decree. She's now a court Jew, C-O-U-R-T, and C-A-U-G-H-T, I suppose. She's now a Jew in the palace, and she's going to be okay. Sorry, yes? Wait, just one moment.
This has been our problem all along. I watched the play called Leopoldstadt, where people made a lot of effort to convert and whatever, and ended up being sent to the concentration camp like everybody else. And the fact that the Jews are so fragmented, if they would all band together and be strong and identify themselves, it would
Maybe.
Plus, the idea of levushim is also like garments of the soul. So I always thought of it as Mordechai was more like Moshe. He was ready to go out and be with the people, even though he had a pal's connection. And Esther was ready to be removed, whether she was coerced in being removed or not. She saw it as a superficial problem. She didn't realize that her wearing those queenly garments was really a separation of who she was supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, or you could interpret it slightly stronger, that she deliberately likes wearing the queenly garments because now she's the queen. And yes.
Didn't you say that she didn't know because she's?
But she knows now.
Away.
She knows now because in Pasuk Zion, Mordechai sent the message of everything that's happening. So that's the transition. That's why I said at the beginning, in answer to your earlier point, she didn't know. She asks Chatach to find out Mazer Ba'al Mazer, what's going on, and Mordechai tells her. So now she does know. So now we come to Mordechai's response. Pasuk Yud Bet, V'yagidu leMordechai et Divrei Esther. Interesting enough, and I'm not going to go on this because I'm not sure I understand the implications of it, but Hatach disappears at this point. Hatach, who was the intermediary in Pasuk Zion and Pasuk Chet and Pasuk Tet, now it's just they, anonymous they, reported what was going on between Mordechai and they reported the words of Esther to Mordechai. Ve'yagidu leMordechai divrei Esther. Pasuk Yud Gimel. Vayomer Mordechai lahashiv el Esther. Mordechai responds to Esther. Al tidami b'nafshech. Don't think for yourself lehimalate that you will escape Beit Hamelech, house of the king, mikol haYehudim, from all the Jews. And I can sort of work backwards. This was the point that I think leads credence to everything I've said up till now. Mordechai actually hits the nail on the head and accuses her of thinking that she'll be safe. Now, just by the way, Bet HaMelech is missing the letter B. It should say B Bet HaMelech, in the house of the king. Don't think you'll be safe in the house of the king. So either you can say the bet should be there and it's missed out from time to time. There are many examples in Tanakh where that happens. Or you can say it's not just the physical palace, it's the whole setup of being the part of the king's household. The fact that you are the king's wife, the fact that you are part of the king's court, that's what you think is going to keep you safe. So Mordechai is very, very harsh. Very harsh. And I think everything's been building up to Pasuk Yud Gimel and especially Pasuk Yud Daled. Mordechai has refused the clothes. He turns up in the sackcloth. That's the first part of the message to Esther. She sends him clothes. He refuses the clothes. Then he tells her what's going on. And at the same time tells her in the same breath what you've got to do. He doesn't say, interestingly enough, we're all going to die and perhaps you can help us, Esther. Any ideas? He says there's only one message, a single message there in Pasuk Chet. We're all going to die and you, I'm commanding you, have got to go to the king. And she refuses. I mean, she's got a reason. She doesn't want to get killed. And she says, everyone knows that, including you, Mordechai, you should know. Says, don't make a silly request. Don't ask me to do something that's impossible. Everyone knows that if you go to the king unannounced, you'll probably get killed. And Mordechai takes this as a refusal to help. A refusal to help the Jews. And as I said, it only makes sense. Esther's logic only makes sense if she thinks she's not going to get caught up in the decree. So Mordechai says to her, Al tidmin b'nafshech, don't think for yourself, lehimalate, that you will escape Beit HaMelech, in the house of the king, or because of the king's household, mikol haYehudim, from amongst all the Jews. Mikol haYehudim. Why? You are amongst the Jews. Maybe you think you're not, but you are amongst the Jews. And now comes Pasuk Yud Daled. I have to take a breath before Pasuk Yud Daled because it's such
so
a...
at which point did Chatach disappear?
Well, he was there in Pasuk Tet when he was standing there in Pasuk Yud. Mordechai sends messages to Esther to tell about the decree, and Esther sends to Chatach to go back to Mordechai and say, I haven't been called to the king, and it's a bit risky if I go to the king without being announced. So he's there in Pasuk Tet. Pasuk Yud. But in Pasuk Yud Bet, he's not there. And the words to Esther's words go to Mordechai via Vayagidu. They said, plural. So we don't know who they are. So now I'm taking a deep breath before Pasuk Yud Daled, because Pasuk Yud Daled to me is quintessential at this moment of the Megillah. It's the quintessential pasuk of the story and of the Jewish experience. Look what he says. Ki'im hacharesh tacharishi ba'et hazot. If you are silent, very silent, at this time, revach v'hatzala ya'amor leYehudim mimakom acher. Relief and salvation will stand for the Jews from another place. What's the other place? So we often say this is an allusion to Hashem. Hashem's name doesn't appear in the Megillah famously, but there are allusions, and this is the clearest. Mordechai says, Rebbe Chatzala will come from another place. It might be he's referring directly to Hashem, or he's saying, just as I wanted you to intervene, and if you like, through human hands, as emissaries of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, solve the problem, maybe somebody else will come and solve the problem under Hashem's guidance. But he doesn't say maybe. So I just put in the word maybe. He doesn't say maybe. He says something very, very profound. Before he gets to the next line, he says, it will definitely happen that we'll be saved. We will be saved. The maybe I put in was not a deliberate mistake, but it was a sort of Freudian slip. He doesn't say maybe. He says, it will come. We will be saved. You know why? Because we're the Jewish people. And the Jewish people carries on. And it might be that we lose many members along the way, as has been our fate throughout history. But miraculously and astonishingly, we're still here. We today in 5785, we're still here. And in those days, also Mordechai is saying the same thing to Esther. We're still here, and we always will be. And the promise that Hashem made to the Jewish people at Sinai will always last. It's a brit, it's a covenant, it will never be violated, it will never be voided. We will always be here. So when I see there's a petition, there's a pashegen, there's an instruction, kill all the Jews, I know with certainty it won't happen. Some Jews might die, but the Jewish people as an entity, I know will carry on. And that's what I mean about this verse saying something so profound about the Jewish story. Mordechai's message, apart until we get to the next line, which is about Esther, but Mordechai's first part of his message is we don't need to worry about the Jewish people because we know that salvation will come from somewhere. The only question is where? Will it come from you or will it come from someone else? So it will definitely come. So he says, line 14, number 14, I'll go back to the beginning. Ki im charashta harishi be'et hazot, Rebbe Chatzala ya'amod le'yodim b'makam acher, va'at u'beit avich tovedu. But if we don't use you, but Rebbe Chatzala comes from somewhere else, you and your father's house will be tovedu, more than destroyed, will be lost, will be negated, will be cancelled. Umi yodea im la'et kazot higat lamalchot. And who knows if it was for this moment that you became queen? Who knows? Again, Mordechai knew what was going on in Pasuk Aleph. In Pasuk Yud Aleph, Esther says, everyone knows the rule about going to the king. Mordechai says, who knows if you became queen for this moment? So let's unpack that Pasuk Yud Aleph. So we started with the first bit, but Mordechai is saying, there will definitely be salvation. I'm not worried about that. The only question is whether the salvation will come via you or via someone else. In other words, there will definitely be a book written about this event. There will definitely be a Megillah. The question is, will it be Megillat Esther? That's your choice, Esther. Will you rise to the occasion and reconnect to the Jewish people? Will you take that responsibility? Or will you leave it to someone else? In which case you will be wiped out. And your father's house, by the way, who's her father's house? Well, Shaul, if you go back. Exactly, Mordechai. Mordechai is the same mishpacha. Well, she's a descendant of King Shaul, Shevet Binyamin. Maybe Shevet Binyamin, it could be. Or maybe the descendants of Shaul. Or maybe just the sort of more localized Mordechai. So we're in it together because we're all part of the same family. But you will be destroyed. Your family will be destroyed. But the Jewish people will carry on. Rebbe v'chatzala. There will be salvation from somewhere else. And then he says, Umi yadeh im la'ed kazot hagat l'malchut. Who knows if it's for this moment that you became queen? Now, what does this imply? This implies there must have been a great wonderment in the household of Mordechai and Esther when Esther is picked to be queen. She's just this little girl from the back of beyond. Not maybe a girl, maybe she's not a girl, maybe she's quite old, but she's from the back of beyond. She's nothing special. And suddenly she's queen. And it might have been a moment when they say, why has this happened? And Mordechai sort of refers back to that wonderment that must have occurred. Maybe we now understand the answer. But I think he's saying something else as well. He's saying, you're enjoying being queen. You don't see a purpose in your being queen except for you to be queen. Now I'm telling you, there's a purpose for you in your being queen, which is to save your people, the Jews. Everything that Mordechai says in this dialogue is about reconnecting Esther to the Jewish people. Just one moment. Mordechai himself is demonstrating that he is avoiding the court and standing outside in the wide spaces of the city, wearing the same sackcloth that all the Jews are wearing. So Mordechai is saying, I am a Jew. Mordechai is saying to Esther, you are a Jew too. There's a decree, and I'm telling you about the decree. I'm sending you a copy of it, that all the Jews are going to be killed. She says, I'm not sure if I can help. And he says, don't think that you will be saved. You won't be saved. I.e., don't think that somehow you're not Jewish. You're just a queen. You only became queen for this purpose. This purpose is to disconnect you from your queenship and to reconnect you to your Jewishness. Yes.
I have a question about one word,
Okay.
which doesn't quite fit in with what I'm hearing, which is the word maybe. Now, why did he put maybe?
No, I didn't.
Why you?
Oh, the last bit. He's saying, "Me, you there? Who would know?" So I took out.
Maybe it's because this time is exactly why you became queen.
Yeah.
Don't say maybe. If it fits into his whole scenario, then
Well,
he would say this is.
Yeah, I hear. It's a good question, but I think perhaps the answer is he can't speak for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It reminds me, sometimes people are a little bit too quick to say, I know that this terrible thing happened because of that particular transgression. No, he's not. He's not second guessing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's not saying Hashem has acted in this way because, and I know why. And that's what he would be doing if he said, definitely, you became queen for this purpose. So I think everything else he's saying, you are a Jew, and that's a fact. But to say you became queen for this purpose, he hasn't quite got the authority to do that.
He's saying me or they.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's saying you will be killed. You will this. You will.
Yeah, that he does know. There's he knows you will be decreed because you will be killed. There's the copy of the decree is on every lamppost, on every street corner. It says, kill the Jews on the 13th of Adar. So he says there's no escape from that. But the bit about why did something happen in the past, that I think he's reticent to claim that he knows the absolute reason for that. Okay, let's move on. What's Esther's response going to be? Mordechai says to Esther, reconnect to your people, act, even risk your life for what's necessary for you to do. 15, Tetvav, V'tomer Esther lahashiv al Mordechai. Esther says to respond to Mordechai. Again, no hatach. Not quite sure how this message gets across. And she says in number 16, Lech kanus et kol hayudim hanimtzaim b'Shushan. Go, gather together all the Jews who are found in Shushan, v'tzamu alai, and they should fast for me, v'al tachlu, and they should not eat, v'al tishtu, and they should not drink. I saw a suggestion, but that's also a breaking away from Persian custom, not to drink, i.e., Shalosha Yomim, for 3 days, Laila v'yom, night and day. V'gam ani v'na'arotai atzum kain. And also I and my servants will fast similarly. What's she doing? She's reconnecting to the Jewish people. She says, I'm going to do this. That's the next slide, but I think you knew that was going to come. She says, I'm going to do this, but I need help. From whom do I need the help? From the Jewish people. I need them to do something for me if I'm going to now be their representative. So I need them all to fast. And then she says, I'm going to fast too. Now, that might have seemed like an innocent, almost irrelevant comment. Of course she's going to join in. It would be a bit strange to tell everyone else to fast and she doesn't fast. Mind you, it just occurs to me. She's got a good reason for not fasting. Because when she goes to the king, she wants to look as pretty and as attractive as possible. And fasting for 3 days is not necessarily the best preparation for dressing yourself up to meet your husband. But anyway, but I think it's based on the approach that I've taken, I think those words, I will fast also, are very, very significant. Fasting for 3 days and nights is the exact epitome of living in the luxury and the opulence of the palace. I'm going to divest myself of all the gratifications that I'm used to, and I'm going to do what I'm asking the Jewish people to do. They're going to have to undertake this hard fast. I'm going to have to undertake this hard fast. Because, you know why? Because I am a Jew. And what the Jewish people go through, I will now go through. And I'm prepared to take the lead, like Mordechai said. Ubechein, and thus, avo el hamelech, I will go to the king. Asher lo kedat, which is against the rules. Uka'asher avadati. Amongst the most poignant words in the Tanakh, amongst the most poignant words in Jewish history. I now understand what Mordechai was telling me, that if I do nothing, I will be lost. The same word as la'abed that Haman keeps using when he wants to lose, deny, negate, cancel out all the Jews. Same word. And she says, I'll take it upon myself. If that is to be my fate, like it is for all my fellow Jews, then yes, it will be my fate. Now, I suggested that this is the pivot point. This is the pivot point in many respects, in that Esther has now been transformed. Esther, who was the one who was unwilling to help, or let's just say nervous about putting herself forward to help, Esther is the one who, according to this approach, was disconnecting. I'll say that rather than disconnected, but disconnecting from her Jewish roots, and she's now been brought back to her Jewish roots. But there's more than that. Esther, until this moment, if you look carefully through the Megillah, has always been passive. She's had things done to her. She was taken from her house to be part of the so-called beauty contest. She was given 6 months in oil and 6 months in myrrh, or whatever, all those things that happened. Incredibly long preparation process. But again, she wasn't active. She's chosen to be queen. She's not active. Something is done to her. And she is, at the beginning of this chapter, disconnected. She's stuck away in the palace. She doesn't even know what's going on. Now she takes the initiative. To use the modern phrase, she takes back agency. And now, whereas Mordechai was issuing instructions to her, she is issuing instructions to him. She says, Lech kanus ekal Yehudim. You've now, I'm telling you what's going to happen. You've got to go and make sure that all the Jews gather together and fast in Shushan. And now the last verse suddenly becomes much, much more significant. The last verse you might have seen as just a sort of addendum, yes, it sort of happened. But look carefully in Yud Zayim. For Ya'avor Mordechai. Mordechai passed. There's a discussion about what that means, but not for us today. Vayas kachol asher tzivta oleh alav Esther. He did everything that Esther had commanded him. Who's in charge? Esther. Esther is giving out the instructions. Mordechai, who's been nudging her, more than nudging her, and castigating her, almost chastising her, she's now calling the shots. Well, I would put it slightly differently. I would say now the book is going to be called, Megillas Esther. And this is the moment where it all changes. And Esther goes to the king, and we'll see what happens in a minute. And now Esther is taking charge. The book is called Megillah Esther. The Jews are on the path to salvation. And that is my analysis of Perek Dalet. But what did I promise you at the beginning? I'm going to disconnect from that. Okay, so this says Esther Perek Dalet. I want to share with you a little hobby horse of mine, which bothers me a lot. We often talk about the chapters of Esther, numbers 1 to 10. 10 is a good number. It's a nice round number. I've seen some people want to create a sort of chiastic structure that 1 corresponds to 10 and 2 corresponds to 9. And we often give shiurim on a particular chapter of Esther. Like actually we might do about a particular chapter of Tanakh. And we forget an important thing. The chapters are not Jewish. The chapter divisions are not Jewish. They were put there by the Christians in the Middle Ages. There's a particular name which is associated with the process. I don't know if he was the only one or he led a school who did this. It was called somebody called Stephen Langton, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the first half of the 13th century. A great hater of Jews, by the way. Interesting story in terms of the machinations that were going on between the King of England and the Pope at the time, but that's certainly not our issue. Stephen Langton is the creator of the chapter divisions in the Tanakh. Again, I don't know if he did every one, but we ascribe the process to him. And they are not Jewish. We have our own chapter divisions. What are they? So if you look in a Sefer Torah or in a Megillah, you will find sometimes spaces. Sometimes you'll find a space within on one line. There's words before, there's a space, and there's words after. And that marks the end of what's called a parsha stuma. Stuma for closed, because the space is closed on both sides. Sometimes you get a space in the Torah which starts in the middle of the line and goes to the end of the line. That is called a parsha petucha, open parsha, because the space is all the way to the end. It's there in the Sefer Torah. It's there in a Megillah. It's there in the Koran Tanakh, which is one of the great things about the Koran Tanakh. It was the first one to do it. Now I think the Stone Tanakh does it as well. But you can look at the page and you can see clearly where the spaces are. In an older style of Tanakh, which is still published, they don't want to waste space on the pages of the Tanakh, so they put a pei where there is a parsha petucha, and they put a samach where there was a parsha stuma. And roughly speaking, the parsha stuma, which is less of a break, is like a paragraph break, and the parsha petucha is like a chapter break. Those are our chapters, the Jewish ones. Okay, I'll tell you. I'll come back in a minute. And when God gave the Torah, it had those spaces in. So those spaces come from God. The chapter divisions come from the Galach Stephen Langton. The story is, I'm not entirely convinced by this, because it seems, the story is that when the Christians in the Middle Ages debated with the Jews about was their God the Messiah or not, and there were these debates, the Christians would quote literally chapter and verse. They quote the chapter and they quote the verse. So the Jews had to learn what the chapters and what the verses so they could take part in such interactions. It sort of caught on. I'd love to, it seems to me, what would be much better is we could have, instead of chapters, we have our parshiot, which I mean our sedrot, Bereshit, Noach, Lech Lecha, etc. And the average parsha is about 100 to 120 pasukim long. So we would have Parsha Noach, Pasuk 78. That would be our way of referring to it. But I think we're sort of stuck. We're sort of stuck because we have adopted the non-Jewish chapter divisions. I gave a share on Perek Daled, and everyone expected and knew what I was talking about. I think it's too late to revert, but I wish we could. Now, if you look in the Megillah, interesting enough, in the Megillah, there's no Parsha Petucha, there are only a Parsha Stuma, there are the close breaks. But you will see that chapter 4 and chapter 5 constitute one single unit. Chapter 4 and chapter 5 constitute one single unit. There's no break at all. There's a break at the beginning of chapter 4, and there's a break at the end of chapter 5. There's no break between them. So when I give a shir on Perek Daled and I say, look, we've reached the climax at the end, Esther is commanding Mordechai, that's only the middle of the parsha, because the parsha carries on without a break. So what we really need to do is not look at Perek Daled on its own and say, I can see the progression from the beginning to the end of Perek Daled, but we need to look at Perek Daled Hey as a single unit. And what do we find when we have Perek Daled Hey as a single unit? So it starts with, the first half is this. I won't go through this all over again. Then Esther goes to see the king. And the Jewish world must have been very excited. It seems that the Jews of Shushan who've been fasting for 3 days know why they're fasting. Esther's going to see the king. And she'll go and see the king and she'll say, please, Mr. King, save all the Jews and everyone will be happy. And she goes to see the king. She's waited 3 days. The entire Jewish population of Shushan has fasted for this moment. And she says to the king, come to a party. And you and Haman. And what would have been the message to the people outside? By the way, it's a great question of why did she go through this business of the parties? And one answer is she wanted to get the Jews to do teshuvah by making them realize that they had no other salvation, that it wasn't all about her asking the king to save the Jews. So she deliberately, according to this idea, goes off on a different tangent so the Jews will realize that their hope is not in Esther. Or perhaps she had some clever idea of making the king paranoid about what Esther and Haman were getting up to. There's lots of explanations. But what doesn't happen is the Jews are not saved. Sorry, it doesn't happen that the Jews are saved. And in fact, let's go on through Perek Hey. They have the first party. And at the first party, the king says to Esther, tell me what's really, really on your mind. Really, really what you want. And Esther says, I want you to come to another party. And Haman leaves the first party, Sameach v'tov lev, happy and a good heart. And he's so excited that he decides, you know what? I'm not going to wait till the 13th of Adar to kill Mordechai. I want him killed now. And I'm going to go to the king in the middle of the night, or in fact, I'm going to go to the king in the morning and ask him to kill Mordechai now. Is this a good state for the Jews? No, I would suggest that chapter 4, the unit 4-5, chapter 4 and chapter 5 together, is a tremendous anticlimax. So yes, Mordechai persuades Esther to assume the responsibility and go and plead for her people. She doesn't do that. And at the end of chapter 5, which is this one single unit, things are looking really, really bad. Esther's busy working out seating plans for parties. Haman's happier than ever before. The gallows on which he plans to hang Mordechai has been erected in his back garden. Things could not be worse. That's the end of the chapter 4-5 unit. So the next words at the beginning of chapter 6 is Balayla Hazeh, Balayla Hahu, Nadada Shenat HaMelech. The king's sleep was disturbed. And from that moment, things go in the other direction. The king decides he has to honor Mordechai. Haman turns up in the palace in the middle of the night thinking that he's going to get the honor, but in fact, he has to lead the horse. And then at the very next moment, Haman's dead. So it's the end of chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 6 is really, I think, the pivot point. And that is reflected, if you look in the text, there's a space. The end of chapter 5, we take a breath, and then chapter 6 starts. So chapter 4 and chapter 5 should not be seen in their own, a separate parakim. And it really does actually bother me when I hear people talk about, let's look at chapter 4, let's look at chapter 5, let's match up chapter 5, chapter 6, etc. Because they're not using God's parshiot, they're using Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton's parshiot, and that's a mistake. So if you look at chapter 4 and chapter 5 as one unit, you actually get a very different picture. So I did chapter 4 because I love it, and I find it so much, it's so rich, it's so much to talk about. But I have to be intellectually honest and say chapter 4 is just the first half of the unit. The second half is nothing gets better. Nothing gets better. It actually gets worse. So really, if you're asking where is the pivot point, it's not here. It's not at the end of chapter 4, which is the middle of the chapter 4-5 unit. It's at the end of chapter 5, before the beginning of chapter 6. By the end of chapter 5, things could not get worse. In chapter 6, things get better. That's the pivot point. Yes?
So the markings of where the chapters are according to our Jewish approach. The Gilad Esther wasn't given by God.
Yeah, true. It was given by...
It's God's parshiot.
Yeah, I actually... Okay, we'll accept that, yes. Okay, I wish you all a happy Purim.